Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Fear Files. Today, we're diving deep into the dark side of Christmas. I've dug up 3 chilling, allegedly true stories that will make you think twice about decking the halls this year. So grab your eggnog, turn down the lights, and get ready for a frightfully festive experience. Let's begin. What if your cheerful neighbor, known for his over-the-top Christmas decorations, harbored a secret so chilling it would haunt you for years? Marcus thought he'd moved into a perfect new neighborhood, but as the festive lights twinkled, an unsettling discovery left him questioning everything. What was so unusual about a simple Christmas decoration, and why would no one else remember it? Stay tuned for a gripping story of a holiday gone eerily wrong, one that will leave you speechless and looking at your neighbors differently this Christmas. My name is Marcus, and this story takes place when I was 10 years old. My family had just moved to a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, right before the holiday season. My dad had been transferred for work, and we were all trying to adjust to the change. Our new house was charming, a modest 2-story with a red front door and a snowy pine tree in the front yard. It felt like the perfect place to spend Christmas. On our first day in the neighborhood, we noticed Ted. Ted lived across the street and was hard to miss. He was a cheerful, balding man in his late 50s, with a round belly and a thick white beard. My mom joked that he looked like Santa Claus in civilian clothes. Ted was also the kind of person who seemed to know everyone. He waved at us as we unloaded boxes from the moving truck and crossed the street to introduce himself. He even brought us a plate of homemade gingerbread cookies, which my little sister devoured almost instantly. But what really stood out about Ted was his obsession with Christmas decorations. His yard was filled with an overwhelming display of holiday cheer. Strings of colorful lights wrapped around every tree and bush, candy cane arches lining the driveway, a glowing nativity scene, and the piece de resistance, a life-size Santa Claus statue that stood right in the middle of his lawn. It wasn't one of those inflatable ones either. This Santa was solid, detailed, and almost too realistic. The first time I saw it, I did a double take, half expecting it to move. "Ted really goes all out for Christmas," my mom said as we unpacked. "Isn't it wonderful?" At first, I agreed. It was fun to look at all the decorations, and Ted's enthusiasm was contagious. He even invited us to his annual neighborhood Christmas party, which he promised would be a night to remember. My parents, eager to make friends in our new community, accepted the invitation right away. As the days passed, I found myself staring at Ted's Santa statue more and more. There was something about it that unsettled me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. It wasn't creepy, exactly, but it was off. Maybe it was the way its eyes seemed to follow you as you walked past, or the way the faint light from the street lamp cast strange shadows across its face at night. Whenever I mentioned it to my parents, they just laughed and told me I was imagining things. One evening, about a week before Christmas, I was outside helping my dad put up our own decorations. It was bitterly cold, and my breath came out in little white puffs. Across the street, Ted's yard was already fully illuminated, a kaleidoscope of red, green, and gold. As I adjusted a string of lights on our porch, I glanced over at the Santa statue. It stood there, silent and unchanging, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. "You've been staring at that thing all night," my dad said, chuckling. "What's so interesting about it?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It just looks so real." My dad shrugged. "Ted probably spent a fortune on it. He's retired, has plenty of time to fuss over his decorations." I nodded, but the unease lingered. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself staring out the window at the glowing decorations across the street. The Santa statue was just barely visible in the darkness, its outline illuminated by the soft glow of Christmas lights. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to convince myself that I was being ridiculous. The night of Ted's party finally arrived. My mom made her famous spinach dip, and my dad brought a bottle of wine as a gift for Ted. The house was packed with neighbors, all of whom seemed to know each other well. Ted was in his element, laughing and telling stories about his grandkids. His house was just as festive on the inside as it was on the outside, with garlands draped over every surface and Christmas music playing softly in the background. At some point during the evening, I wandered outside to get some fresh air. The cold was biting, and the yard was eerily quiet compared to the warmth and noise inside. I found myself drawn to the Santa statue again. Up close, it was even more detailed than I'd realized. The beard looked almost real, and the wrinkles on its face were so precise that I could see tiny cracks in the paint. I reached out to touch it, hesitating for a moment before my fingers brushed against its surface. The statue was cold and hard, just like I'd expected. But as I pulled my hand away, I noticed something strange. There was a faint smudge of red paint on my fingertips. I wiped it off on my coat and decided it was time to head back inside. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about that smudge of paint. It didn't make sense. The statue looked like it had been there for years, yet the paint seemed fresh. When I mentioned it to my mom on the way home, she dismissed it as a kid's imagination running wild. Christmas Eve came quickly. That night, as my family gathered in the living room to watch a holiday movie, I caught myself glancing out the window again. Ted's yard was as bright as ever, and the Santa statue stood in its usual spot. But something about the way the lights flickered across its face made me shiver. At some point, I must have fallen asleep on the couch because the next thing I remember is waking up to complete darkness. The power had gone out, and the house was silent except for the faint hum of the wind outside. I groggily made my way to the window and peered out, hoping to see some sign of light. Ted's yard was dark, too, but the Santa statue was still visible, its outline stark against the snowy ground. And then it hit me. The statue wasn't in its usual spot. It was closer, much closer. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was imagining things, but when I looked again, it was still there, standing at the edge of Ted's driveway. My heart pounded as I stepped away from the window. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, Christmas Day, we woke up to find the neighborhood buzzing with activity. A police car was parked outside Ted's house, and a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. My dad went outside to see what was going on, and when he came back, his face was pale. "Ted passed away last night," he said quietly. "The paramedics think it was a heart attack." I felt a pang of sadness. Ted had been so full of life just a few days ago. But as I glanced out the window, my sadness turned to confusion. The Santa statue was gone. There wasn't even an imprint in the snow where it had stood. It was as if it had never been there at all. "What happened to the statue?" I asked. My dad frowned. "What statue?" "The Santa Claus," I said. "The one Ted always put up." He shook his head. "Marcus, I don't think Ted had a Santa statue. You must be thinking of another house." I stared at him, dumbfounded. How could he not remember? I turned to my mom, but she gave me the same confused look. "I'm sorry, sweetie," she said. "I don't remember seeing any statue either." To this day, I don't know what to make of that Christmas. I've tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe Ted's decorations were packed away before anyone noticed. But deep down, I'm not so sure. Every December, when I see the holiday lights go up around my neighborhood, I find myself thinking back to Ted's Santa statue and wondering if I'll ever see it again. On a lonely Christmas Eve in the deep woods of Minnesota, one man's grief is interrupted by an encounter that feels both ordinary and deeply unsettling. A group of Victorian-style carolers, a mysterious gift, and a connection to a forgotten past leave him questioning everything. As snow falls and the fire flickers, he's drawn into a chilling story that blurs the line between coincidence and fate. Was it chance or something far more profound? This Christmas tale will leave you breathless. I've always hated Christmas. I know it's not what people expect to hear from someone my age, but the holiday lost its magic for me years ago. My wife, Mary, used to light up this season. She loved every little thing about it, from baking cookies to stringing up the lights on our cabin. But since she passed 5 years ago, Christmas has become just another day to survive. Alone. This year, as usual, I spent Christmas Eve at my cabin in northern Minnesota. It's remote, surrounded by miles of dense forest, and quiet enough to drown out the memories I'd rather not face. The fireplace crackled in front of me as I sipped a glass of bourbon. The weather forecast promised snow, and the wind outside was already picking up, howling through the trees like a distant cry. I just settled deeper into my armchair when I heard it, singing, faint at first, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I thought I was imagining it. After all, who would be out here, miles from town, in freezing temperatures? But the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was unmistakably Christmas carols. Silent night. I got up and peered out the window. Nothing. Just the dark forest, snowflakes swirling under the dim glow of my porch light. The singing continued, growing closer. My pulse quickened, though I couldn't say why. It wasn't fear exactly, but something about it unsettled me. The voices were harmonious, melodic, yet strange. The lyrics were the same, but the cadence felt off, like they were singing an older version of the song. Grabbing my coat and flashlight, I stepped outside. The cold bit at my face immediately, but I barely noticed. The singing seemed to be coming from the direction of the trail that led deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed it. After a few minutes of trudging through the snow, I saw them, a small group of people standing in a clearing. There were 6 of them, 4 adults and 2 children, dressed in what looked like Victorian-style clothing. Heavy coats, long scarves, and hats that seemed straight out of an old photograph. They stood in a circle, facing inward, singing. A lantern sat in the middle of their circle, casting a warm, golden glow. "Merry Christmas," I called out, my voice sounding far too loud in the stillness. The singing stopped abruptly, and they all turned to look at me. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the men, tall with a trimmed beard and a kind face, stepped forward. "And a blessed Christmas to you," he said, his voice warm. "Forgive us if we startled you. We meant no intrusion." "No, it's fine," I said, though my heart was still pounding. "I just wasn't expecting anyone." The man smiled. "We often take to the woods on Christmas Eve to sing and reflect. A family tradition, you might say. It's rare we meet anyone out here." I nodded, feeling a bit self-conscious. "It's a nice tradition. Your singing is beautiful." One of the children, a girl no older than 8, stepped forward and held out a small, wrapped box. "For you," she said, her voice soft. I hesitated before taking it. The paper was simple, tied with a red ribbon. "Thank you," I said, though I had no idea what to make of it. "Merry Christmas," the group said in unison, before turning and walking away, their lantern casting long shadows as they disappeared into the trees. I called after them, wanted to ask more questions, but they didn't stop. Within seconds, they were gone, leaving only the faint crunch of snow in their wake. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. The wind picked up again, reminding me how cold it was. Clutching the small box, I made my way back to the cabin. Inside, the fire had nearly gone out. I placed the box on the table and stoked the flames back to life. Sitting down, I examined the gift. It was light, almost as though it were empty. Carefully, I untied the ribbon and peeled back the paper. Inside was a small, antique locket. The gold was tarnished, the design intricate but worn with age. I opened it, revealing a faded photograph inside. My breath caught in my throat. It was Mary, or someone who looked exactly like her. The resemblance was uncanny. The same warm smile, the same soft curls framing her face. But that was impossible. This photograph looked ancient, far older than any picture of Mary the First had ever seen. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Who were those people? How did they have this? And why give it to me? None of it made sense. The cabin was silent except for the crackle of the fire. I sat at the table, the locket lying open in my palm. The photograph of Mary seemed to stare back at me. The longer I looked, the more the resemblance tugged at memories buried deep within me. I could hear Mary's laughter, picture her smile on those winter mornings when we'd sit by the fire drinking coffee. The locket was a cruel reminder of what I'd lost, yet I couldn't bring myself to put it down. I spent the rest of the evening pacing the room, replaying my encounter with the carolers in my head. There had been something serene about them, almost too serene, and the way they disappeared into the woods without a trace. It wasn't supernatural, but it was certainly strange. My rational mind told me they were just a quirky family with a penchant for old traditions. But something deeper gnawed at me, a feeling I couldn't shake. I barely slept that night. When I did, my dreams were vivid and unsettling. I was walking through the woods, following the sound of carolers. The singing grew louder, but when I reached the clearing, they were gone. In their place stood Mary, holding the locket and smiling at me. I tried to speak to her, but my voice wouldn't come. She opened the locket, and I woke up in a cold sweat. By morning, the storm had fully rolled in. Snow blanketed the ground, and the sky was a heavy, unbroken gray. I stared at the locket again as I ate breakfast, running my thumb over the tarnished surface. It felt like it was begging for my attention, pulling me towards something I didn't understand. I decided to do some investigating. I drove into town and visited the Historical Society, hoping to find answers. An elderly woman named Margaret greeted me at the front desk. When I showed her the locket and the photograph, her eyes widened. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her tone urgent. I hesitated. "It was given to me by some carolers in the woods." Margaret frowned. "This belonged to Eleanor Graves. She was a young woman who lived here in the late 1800s. The story goes that she died tragically on Christmas Eve, though no one knows exactly how. Her family left town shortly after, and the locket was thought to be lost." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Does she look familiar to you?" I asked, pointing to the photograph. Margaret studied it for a moment. "She does look remarkably like someone I've seen before. Perhaps a relative?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. Margaret offered to let me look through some old records, but nothing I found provided any clarity. If anything, it only deepened the mystery. By the time I got back to the cabin, the snowstorm had started. I spent the rest of the day trying to make sense of it all. Who were the carolers? Why did they give me the locket? And what connection, if any, did it have to Mary? That night, as the wind howled outside, I sat by the fire, the locket in my hand. I thought about Mary, about the life we'd shared and the love we'd lost. And for the first time in years, I felt something other than grief. It was faint, but it was there, a sense of peace, as though Mary's spirit was still with me, guiding me. The carolers didn't return, but every Christmas Eve after that, I'd leave a candle burning in the window, just in case they ever decided to come back. Christmas is a time for family, joy, and cherished traditions. But what if a simple holiday gathering unveiled something far more unsettling? In this gripping story, one family's festive reunion takes an unexpected turn when a discovery in the attic raises questions no one can answer. As the snow falls and the clock ticks, secrets from the past creep into the present, and nothing is as it seems. Stay tuned to uncover the chilling tale of a Christmas celebration that will leave you questioning everything. It was the Christmas I spent at my cousin Emma's house that I'll never forget. Emma had inherited the old family home, a sprawling Victorian with gabled roofs and a wraparound porch that looked like something out of a historical painting. She'd spent years restoring it, and this was the first Christmas she was hosting for the family. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. Emma and I had always been close, and I loved her enthusiasm for tradition. When I arrived, snow was already falling in thick, heavy flakes. The house looked beautiful, with its windows glowing warmly against the cold. Emma greeted me at the door with her signature tight hug and a bright smile. She was wearing a red sweater with reindeer on it, and her auburn hair was pulled back into a loose braid. "Welcome. Come in, she said, ushering me inside. The interior of the house was just as I remembered from childhood, though Emma had added her own touches. A garland wound around the banister, candles in every window, and the scent of cinnamon wafting from the kitchen. The dining table was already set with Emma's best china, and a massive Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, its branches laden with delicate glass ornaments. "Everyone's already here," Emma said, taking my coat. "You're just in time for hot cider." The rest of the family greeted me warmly, and we spent the afternoon catching up, playing games, and reminiscing. There was a comforting familiarity to it all, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slightly off. Maybe it was the way Emma kept glancing at the clock, or how she seemed unusually quiet during dinner, but I brushed it off as holiday stress. Hosting this many people couldn't have been easy. After dinner, Emma brought out a box of family heirlooms she'd found while cleaning out the attic. "I thought it would be fun to go through these together," she said, setting the box on the coffee table. Inside were faded photographs, old letters, and a few small trinkets: a tarnished brooch, a silver hairbrush, a pocket watch. The pocket watch caught my eye immediately. It was ornate, with an intricate design etched into the case. When I picked it up, I noticed it was still ticking. "Does it still work?" I asked, holding it up. "Apparently," Emma said with a shrug. "I wound it up when I found it, and it just started ticking. Kind of amazing, isn't it?" I opened the watch to look at the face. The time was accurate, and the second hand moved steadily. But what struck me most was the engraving on the inside of the lid: December 25th, 1897. "Do you know who this belonged to?" I asked. Emma shook her head. "No idea. It's been in the family for generations, though." I set the watch down and picked up one of the photographs. It showed a group of people standing in front of the house, men in suits and women in long dresses, all staring solemnly at the camera. The photo was yellowed with age, but I could still make out the details. "This must have been taken right here," I said, pointing to the porch in the background. "Probably," Emma said. "The house has been in the family since the late 1800s. I studied the faces in the photograph, feeling an odd sense of recognition. "Do you think any of these people are our relatives?" "Most likely," Emma said, "but I couldn't tell you who's who." The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, though I found myself drawn back to the box of heirlooms several times. There was something about the objects that fascinated me, as if they carried a weight of stories long forgotten. That night, I had trouble sleeping. My room was one of the guest bedrooms upstairs, with a large window overlooking the backyard. The snow was still falling, and the world outside was silent and still. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to pinpoint what was bothering me. It wasn't the house itself. Emma had done a fantastic job making it feel warm and inviting. But there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name. The next morning, I woke early and decided to take a walk before breakfast. The snow had stopped, and the world was bathed in a pale, golden light. I wrapped myself in a coat and scarf and stepped outside, crunching through the fresh snow. The air was crisp and cold, and my breath hung in clouds before me. As I walked around the house, I noticed something odd. There were tracks in the snow leading from the back door to the edge of the yard, where they disappeared into the trees. They were faint, as if they'd been made during the night and partially covered by the falling snow. I frowned, trying to make sense of them. They didn't look like animal tracks, but they were too small to be from an adult. A child, maybe? But that didn't make sense. Emma's kids were all accounted for, and no one else in the family had brought children. I followed the tracks to the edge of the yard, where they stopped abruptly. There was no sign of anyone having entered the trees, no broken branches or disturbed snow. It was as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. A chill ran down my spine, and I turned back toward the house, eager to put some distance between myself and the inexplicable tracks. When I mentioned the tracks to Emma over breakfast, she dismissed them with a wave of her hand. "Probably just one of the kids playing outside," she said. But her tone was a little too casual, and I noticed she didn't look me in the eye. I decided not to press the issue. Maybe she'd seen them too, and didn't want to make a big deal out of it. The rest of the day was busy with holiday activities. We exchanged gifts, played board games, and indulged in Emma's homemade Christmas cookies. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Emma seemed distracted, and I caught her glancing out the window more than once. When I asked if everything was okay, she just smiled and said, "Of course." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself drawn back to the box of heirlooms. I sat on the couch in the dimly lit living room, sifting through the objects again. The pocket watch was still ticking, its steady rhythm filling the silence. I picked up another photograph, a different group of people, but the same house in the background. This time, the faces looked even more familiar. One of the women had Emma's sharp cheekbones, and one of the men had the same piercing eyes as my uncle. As I stared at the photograph, a thought struck me. What if these weren't just distant relatives? What if they were us? I shook my head, dismissing the idea as ridiculous. But the nagging feeling of familiarity wouldn't go away. The next morning, I woke to find the house unusually quiet. The family had gathered in the dining room for breakfast, but the mood was subdued. Emma looked tired, as if she'd been up all night. When I asked her what was wrong, she just shook her head and said, "Nothing. Let's just enjoy the day." It wasn't until later that I noticed the photograph on the mantelpiece. It hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. It was the same photograph I'd seen in the box, the one with the group of people standing in front of the house. But now it was framed and displayed as if it had always been there. When I asked Emma about it, she just shrugged and said, "Oh, that? It's been there for years." I stared at the photograph, my mind racing. The faces were unmistakable. It was us, and yet, the date scrawled in the corner read 1897.